All right, so welcome back to episode 3 of our little installment here of the one-piece mini tub wheel wells. So this will be the last episode in this series on making this. And just like in the last episode where I was refining the surface with the planishing hammer, that's a lot of what this episode is going to be, is just time on the air planisher. Roughly right now there's probably about an hour and a half to 2 hours worth of planishing left to do. So it's not going to be really exciting to watch. So this may be a short episode. We'll just kind of have to see how the footage plays out as I planish everything. So it might be a 5-minute episode, super sped up, to not be super tedious. But that's the problem, is when you get to this point, it's not super exciting. It's not a wow factor. It's just a lot of time spent refining and cleaning up lines and pushing light around. So stick around, and I'm going to get back on the air planisher, and we're just going to keep going at it with the 36, get everything dialed in, and then I can come back and focus more on the radius right here. So let's go. All right, so I know this part is really boring to just watch be planished and planished and planished and planished, but this is one thing that I think really separates a finished part and an almost finished part. Because right now, I mean, I could stop here and we'd be about what I would declare an 80% finished out part. Like, I still need to trim the edge, but we're not talking about that. There's still a few little waves. Like here you can see there's a little bit of a low spot, and as you rub your hand over it, you can feel minor imperfections, and the light line's a little wiggly, and the surface finish isn't completely dialed in. So most of the time people would declare this good enough. But if you really want to push your standards and your quality, there's no such thing as good enough. You can only do what's good enough within the budget. So you know, I don't want to metal finish these absolutely perfect to where it could be polished, but I also want to uphold my standards on what I declare a finished part. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this, and like I said, I know it's terrible to just watch a part being planished, but it shows you, especially being sped up, you can see the panel changing quickly. And also it just shows that it's not a quick, simple process. It's very time consuming, it's very tedious, and just imagine, you know, you're watching this video in a matter of minutes, let alone me having to stand in front of a planishing hammer for hours to refine light lines and surface finish. So I think this is a really good tool to show you how to make the part, but also the time and the effort that is involved. It's not necessarily talent or skill always. A lot of it comes down to just putting in the time. So, you know, that's 90% of what it is. It's just the effort and doing it. And I had a couple people ask me about time invested. So while talking about time, I have about 4 to 5 hours per wheel well to make. So I would say, you know, just a nice round number, 10 hours to make the pair. Some might think that's a lot, some might think that's not very much time. I think it's about average. I mean, I think it's a good place to be at. I don't feel that it took me overly long, but I didn't rush through it as well. So I'm really happy with the way they're coming out. And one thing I didn't film while I was doing it, because I just let the camera run and I clipped out where I walked away, but when you get oil all over your panel, especially with planishing, the oil will leave a texture. It won't shine up as nice. So I would walk over and I'd take a towel and some Windex and I would clean all the oil off and I would continue to dry planish. That'll help bring up the shine and I can watch what the light's doing better and not be thrown off by oil on the panel. When you're shaping on the hammer, you need that lubrication, but when you're finished planishing, I always like to dry planish. That way it really burnishes everything up. And with that, you can see there's spots where the line's been rubbed off. So I touch up my my lines where the start of the radius is and the stop of the radius. That way I have a good guideline of where I need to work and where I need to focus with the radius tool versus the low crown tool to get everything to blend together. So I'm gonna get back to the boring part of planishing everything out. And if you've made it this far, I appreciate you guys watching, and hopefully you continue to watch. And after I get some more planishing done, we'll sit back down and I'll do like kind of some pan overs and you can see the refined finish of the finished wheel well. Before I wrap this video and this series up, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I'm doing and what's happening during the blending and the planishing process that you saw in episode 2 and in this episode with finishing everything out. So I'm going to bring the camera in and I'll kind of show some small illustrations and some tooling to kind of explain it as I go, similar like I did in episode 1 with showing how tuck shrinking worked. So let me pull the camera in and we'll talk about what's going on with blending and planishing, and we'll get into a type of stretching that we're not doing in this video, and just to kind of build on that and start laying the groundwork for future videos. So here are our illustrations from before, talking about shrinking, gathering, tucking, and our side profile of what we're doing, a little bit of grain structure work. So if you haven't watched episode 1, I suggest going back and catching the beginning of the series where we talk about this to get the shaping process started with shrinking our edges over. So I'm going to put this to the side because we've already talked about it. But what I want to talk about is like doing blending on the power hammer and planishing. And planishing is an act. It's not necessarily a tool. It is an act of working the metal. And you're stretching a little bit, and when you're blending, you're stretching a little bit, but I wanted to talk about the types of stretch. So whether you're using a wheeling machine, hammer and dolly, hammer on a piece of railroad tie, power hammer, planishing hammer, whatever, you're going to get 2 types of stretching. And that is going to be a radial stretch and a linear stretch. So I'm not going to talk a lot about linear stretch because we're not doing any linear stretching on this, but this is what I said I wanted to lay a little bit of groundwork. So we'll start with radial because that's what we have been using. So when we radial stretch, it's exactly what it sounds like. Our tooling, our hammer, whatever we're using comes down and hits a point of contact, wherever that may be, and it spreads that force out evenly in all directions. So like if we have a hammer face, you know, our point of contact is going to be roughly right here in the center of our hammer. So as we hit, that's going to come down and that's going to spread that force out evenly in every direction. So when you're blending or you're like doing low crown panel work like a roof insert or a door skin, that's all achieved by radial stretch because you are hitting and you are growing a compound shape by the material thinning in every direction evenly. And again, we're talking about our 5 core principles. We can shrink, stretch, cut, bend, and weld. So there's been a little bit of discussion in the comment section, and I'm not going to get into a bunch of that here. But we shrank on the wheel well, and then we're going to stretch. So we're going to use our shrinking and stretching, which is how you shape sheet metal. So when we're blending, we have the knots that you could see in last episode where our shrinks started and stopped. So that needs to be blended out. So we're going to use the power hammer to do that. And when you're hammering, you're hitting harder and a little bit slower than using a planishing hammer or doing hand planish work. And what that does is that just moves everything out and you get a more uniform surface. So from there, that is a radial type of stretch. We're not stretching a ton, but we are stretching. So from there you go to the act of planishing. So it is a very light hit and very fast, and that's in comparison to hammering. It's kind of hard to describe. It's not an exact force reference, but when you run a power hammer, you can feel that it hits hard and at a slower beats per minute. And when you switch to a planishing hammer, it hits lighter, but a lot faster and beats per minute. And that's all relative to how you have the machine set up. So we'll go from blending out all our shrink marks to planishing, and what that does is it's just that light, fast hit, and you're skimming over the surface and it's raising the low spots up a little bit and just blending that surface and fine-tuning everything. So here are a couple pieces of tooling we used. So a lot of times I use the large 3-inch flat top upper tooling. That way it spreads our contact pattern out quite a bit. And the two tooling pieces we used on the lower for all of the planishing here is we used a 36-inch radius, and that did our top and our face of the wheel well. And then I used this 7/8 tool, and that was mainly for the main radius on our wheel well to clean everything up after the fact. So those are the tools we used in the planishing act. And like I said, planishing is just fast and light. It's a lot deeper of a concept than I'm talking about right here, but I just don't want to muddy the water too much in the end of this video series. And then the other type of stretch is linear. So it's exactly what it sounds like. When you hit on an edge, so we'll just say that this is our lower anvil here, and you hit here with the hammer, it's thinned, so it moves the material outward from that center line in a line. That's how you get reverse curves, and you can undo some of the shrinking you've done if you over shrink a panel. A lot of times I'll come back with a linear die and work on stretching out just where I had shrank. So those were the radial is the main type of stretching and blending we were doing on our wheel well here. So hopefully that makes sense and you have a better insight to what we were doing with blending and planishing. So I'm going to show you one more thing with a radius gauge and checking the radius on our wheel well, and then I'll get to wrapping up this video. So with our first wheel well sitting here, how do I know that this is the radius that I want? Other than through trial and error and eyeballing it to make sure that everything is smooth and consistent, you can use different radius gauges. Like I've got a bunch of pre-made handheld ones that I use a lot to get me in the ballpark, but if it's an oddball size, what I'll do is I'll make my own little contour gauge here for the desired radius I want. So if I'm pulling that off of a piece and I need to duplicate that radius, I can do that and then transfer this. And then I can just come down and I can check our radius in a few spots across and make sure it's in the ballpark of what I want. And then when we go to the other one, we can also check that with our radius gauge. So you can use cardboard, you can use plastic, just anything that's going to hold this radius really nice to make it repeatable and to where you can check the part you're working on and you can ensure that it's the right radius and it's consistent all the way through. So hopefully using a radius gauge will help you guys get things tidy and consistent. So there we have it. We have a left wheel well and a right wheel well all knocked out. Everything's planished, looking good. There still might be a little bit of refinement work once we get the quarter panels made. So these are the wheel wells for the Model A quarters that I'm working on. So once we get the quarter panels made off the pattern, there might be a little bit of fine tuning that we need to do to either bring this edge in a little bit tighter or relax it out a little bit to meet the opening in the quarter panel. So at this point, I'm going to call them ready to go, and then we'll refine that later on down the road. So hopefully you guys find this 3-part series informational. Hopefully it's the kind of stuff you guys want to see, because it's the stuff I like to produce. So please drop down in the comment section. Let me know if you liked it, if you hated it, you want to see more of it, you don't want to see any of it all, or if you have any suggestions on realistic parts that I can do in the shop. I get a lot of questions about, why don't you do stuff with hand tools more? And, you know, why don't you wheel parts? And a lot of that comes from the cars that are in here are not my own personal vehicles. They're client cars, so I have to stay up on my efficiency and detail and do things the way I need to do in a production setting. So that's why I focus a lot on the power equipment, because it's what I'm used to, and I can produce my parts faster, more efficiently, and with a higher level of quality in that time span than doing it all with hand tools. So hopefully, if the channel gets bigger, I can focus more on hand tool type stuff, but for now, I'm just doing parts and pieces of cars that I'm working on in the shop, so I have to focus on the day-to-day production style work, so that's why I use the power equipment. But again, if you have any recommendations for parts or questions you want to have answered or certain topics you want covered, please feel free to let me know in the comment section, and I really do appreciate you guys checking these videos out. So if you can, make sure, if you're not subscribed, become a subscriber, like, tell a friend, you know, help this channel grow so I can put out more great content. And thanks again for watching, and we'll catch you guys on the next one.